Very good evening to all of you. I'm Dr. Chaitra Bharat, and I extend a very warm welcome to our guest, Dr. C.L. Lakshmipati Gowda, and the participants on behalf of Phoenix Academy, Mysore. Before we have our speaker start his presentation, let me lay out the usual instructions for all our participants. So participants, please keep your audio and video off at all times. If you have any queries or if you have questions for the speaker, please drop it in the chat box and we will take all your questions only at the end of the presentation. So please wait till the end to have your queries answered. Also, keep a note on your chat box for instructions in between the presentation. The link to the feedback form, which in turn gets you the e-certificate, will be posted at the end of the session in the chat box. So please be ready to click on it because the link is active only for 24 hours. So you only have that window to have your e-certificates. So please be wary of your what's happening in the chat box. I would love to now introduce our eminent guest on today's webinar, that is Dr. C.L. Lakshmipati Gowda sir. Lakshmipati Gowda sir is a PhD in genetics. He was the Deputy Director General at ICRISAT, Hyderabad, India. Previously, he was the Director, Grain Legumes Research Program and Director of the Crop Improvement Program at ICRISAT. As a coordinator of the Cereals and Legumes Asia Network, he has worked with 12 Asian countries to strengthen the R&D capacity of the national programs. He has been a consultant to NARS in Bangladesh, China, Indonesia. He has helped to release more than 70 high-yielding chickpea varieties in 30 countries that have made significant impact in farmers' fields. Dr. Gowda was one of the pioneers to initiate the public-private partnership for hybrid parents research consortium at ICRISAT, which is now serving as model for national and CGIAR centers. Honored by many Asian countries for strengthening the national agriculture R&D programs, he has received more than 30 awards, honors, and recognitions from various countries, institutions, and professional societies, including Japan's International Food Award in 2014. He is the Fellow of the Indian National Academy of Agricultural Sciences, Fellow of American Society of Agronomy, Fellow of Indian Crop Science Society, and Indian Society of Genetics and Plant Breeding. He has published more than 360 papers in national and international journals. Currently, he is one of the co-founders of GRSV Consulting Services, which provides consultancy support to institutions and individuals in agriculture research and development. I welcome you to this program, sir, and thank you so much for joining us. It's now over to Lakshmipati Gowda, sir.
Good evening to all of you. I saw quite a few names that are familiar to me. So, hello to all the friends whom I know, and also hi to all my new friends who have joined this webinar. Today, I am going to speak on the importance and utilization of plant genetic resources in crop improvement research and development. Some of my friends whom I know may already have heard my talk on this, so please bear with me. There may be some new information that I have included because about 2 weeks ago I updated my presentation. So here I am talking to you on the importance and utilization of plant genetic resources in crop improvement. So if we talk of germplasm diversity and why is the need, we all are aware. Have I come a little too far? Let me see. Yeah. Okay. I think this is what I thought I missed. This is the outline of my presentation, looking at the importance of global genetic resources, especially plant genetic resources, looking at germplasm conservation practices worldwide, how to enhance the use of genetic resources, looking at pre-breeding activities using the related wild species of crop plants. And briefly, I will look at the intellectual property rights and then the dangers of biopiracy, just for information of the people. And briefly also mention about the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, and mention something about the National Biodiversity Act and its implication for all of us. So I was talking about this germplasm diversity and why do we need it. And as you are aware, during the Green Revolution, we had quite a few highly uniform, high-yielding cultivars that replaced the traditional landrace cultivars, and thus causing genetic erosion and vulnerability of these uniform high-yielding cultivars to many pests and diseases. There are many examples. For example, the southern corn leaf blight epidemic in the USA in the 1970s, and others due to genetic uniformity of the varieties or hybrids. Therefore, scientists recognized the need for diversifying and broadening the genetic base of the cultivars so that they don't become susceptible to a particular disease, or even within a disease, a particular race of that disease or otherwise. So in many cases, what we found is the habitat loss, alteration that has been caused by agriculture, urbanization, pollution, deforestation, invasion of exotic species, and overexploitation have led to loss of germplasm diversity. So if we look at the germplasm, the crop germplasm available for crop improvement globally, we find that about 7.5 million accessions are currently stored in more than 1,750 gene banks. But then all these 7.5 million accessions are not fully unique. Only people say 25 to 30% are unique. The rest are possibly duplications or duplicates. Uh, Only 10% are wild relatives, and among those 7.5 million, about 11% are conserved in the CGIAR Center gene banks. And if you see the slide, you'll find that nearly 45% of the germplasm plant genetic resources are of cereals. Next comes the food legumes, then the forages, vegetables, and nuts, fruits, and berries, and then the rest. So majority goes for cereals and legumes, that makes about 60%, and including forages, it makes about 70% of the genetic resources worldwide. If you look at the major global gene banks, starting from India, the National Bureau of Plant Genetic Resources is conserving more than 4,46,000 accessions. And then similarly, if you go down the list, look at China, about 4,10,000. And if you go down, then you have Japan, the Russian Federation, the UK, Mexico, and many others. And then, of course, there are also other international centers like CIMMYT, which is conserving about 164,000, and then ICARDA about 148,000, and the International Rice Research Institute, IRRI, storing about 132,000 different plant races and wild species of rice. And then, ICRISAT conserving about 124,000 germplasm accessions. So I just gave this as an example of the major global plant genetic resources gene banks that are storing the germplasm collections. So I said only about 11% are being conserved in the CGIAR centers. This map shows different CGIAR centers. Not all of them, there are 15 CGIAR centers. Not all of them have genetic resources. Only 11 of those CGIAR centers have and conserve the plant genetic resources for global use. So now we look at the germplasm conservation, the different methods. Sorry, I clicked. So there are seed gene banks where active collection is conserved, where the seeds are viable between 20 to 25 years. Here, the seeds are stored at 4 degrees Celsius and 30% relative humidity. Seed viability is more than 80% for groundnut and more than 85% for other crops. And in the base collections, which can conserve the seed for more than 50 years, these are stored at minus 20 degrees Celsius with 3 to 7% seed moisture, and the seed viability is more than 85% for groundnut and other oilseed crops, and more than 90% for other crop seeds. So germplasm conservation is also done in the field gene banks for those which have recalcitrant seeds and also for tree species. And the third one is the in vitro gene banks for vegetatively propagated crops. And then in the in vitro, we have in vitro conservation under slow growth. And then we also have cryopreservation. These are the two methods that we use in the in vitro gene banks for vegetatively propagated crops. So in germplasm conservation, you may have heard about what some people call the doomsday seed vault, which is what we call the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which has been established on the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen in the Arctic Svalbard archipelago. Here, the duplicate samples of the major crops, both from Africa and Asia, have been stored. And as of now, more than 1 million samples, that is more than 10.5 lakh samples, have been stored. And as of end of 2019 or early 2020, the CGIAR, the 11 CGIAR gene banks have deposited almost entire seed samples of their collections in the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Just for example, I am giving you the germplasm conservation that is being done at ICRISAT. As all of you are aware, there are 5 mandate crops for ICRISAT: sorghum, pearl millet, chickpea, pigeon pea, and groundnut. It also conserves 6 small millets, that is finger millet, foxtail millet, proso millet, little millet, kodo millet, and barnyard millet. And all these in the active collections, we have about 1,23,000, almost 1,24,000, and in the base collection, which is about minus 20 degrees and more than 50 years of conservation, 1,12,000. Recently, there was a news article you must have seen that ICRISAT is one of the participants in the CGIAR system, where they will be studying the viability of the seeds stored in the gene banks for 100 years. So every 10 years, they are going to take the samples and then check the seed viability, and then it goes for 100 years to see how long we can store the germplasm in the gene banks. This is 5 slides of different crops at ICRISAT to show the diversity of different crops. This slide shows the diversity of sorghum germplasm accessions for the earhead shape, size, and seed color. Diversity of the pulp millet germplasm accessions. As you can see, there are earheads more than 1 meter, and also there are earheads which are about maybe 2 inches or 5 centimeters. But of course, there are different sizes and shapes, and also different seed colors that are available in the germplasm collections. And then all these are region-based or location-specific, because some places in some farming communities, they prefer a particular seed color or seed shape or seed size. So all these are available, conserved in the germplasm collections. This is the diversity for seed size, seed shape, and seed color in chickpea, in pigeon pea, and both seed and pod size and shape in groundnut. So now we shift gears and go to the utilization of germplasm in crop improvement. So if we look at overall around the world, the use of germplasm in breeding, it was found that there has been less than 1% use of the germplasm in most of the crop breeding programs globally. So this is a published paper by Dr. Upadhyaya and his colleagues in 2006. What happens is most breeders tend to use mostly the working collections. And these working collections mostly consist of elite breeding lines and then some improved trait-specific lines. And what happens with this limited number of lines that are being used is that this results in recirculation of the same germplasm, thus leading to the narrow genetic base. So, what are the reasons for low use of germplasm, and then how we can overcome them? And when we look at the reasons, one of the main reasons is breeders don't have the data on the traits of economic importance for selecting these, and then also the large size of collections in some of the crops. For example, in the table I showed you a while ago, the rice collections at the International Rice Research Institute is 132,000. So if you take a breeder and put that breeder in front of those 132,000 germplasm accessions, that breeder, he or she, will not know which one to select because the size is so huge, and without the data and other associated information, the breeder cannot make any decision of which ones to select for use in the breeding programs. So therefore, the germplasm need to be characterized to assess the patterns of diversity, so that based on this, patterns of diversity, we can develop what we call small-sized subsets. And Sir Otto Frankel then called it the core collection, which is about 10% of the entire collection. So in case of the rice genetic resources of 1,32,000, so the 10% would be about 13,200. So because of the reduced size, the core collection can be evaluated, and then the parents for a crossing program can be identified for use by the breeders. I will come to you a little later whether this is feasible and whether it is being used or otherwise. So these are the examples of the core collections of germplasm globally. As you can see here, for different crops, soybean, common bean, groundnut, quinoa, brassica, and many other crops. So all these have core collections because the scientists have been able to characterize them, study the diversity, and then make a set of core collections. And then now, this is the picture on the left shows how do we make these core collections. Step one is characterizing and evaluating the entire collection for collecting the data set. And then you need to form groups based on the diversity analysis, and then into groups that are similar. And then from those different groups, then you start making clusters, and then from these clusters, then you start selecting 10% of that, and then you go down similarly, and then use that core collection for evaluation. So when we studied, we found that even the core collections are not fully useful because sometimes the size of the core itself is quite large. And as indicated here, in case of, I said in rice it is 13,200. In case of sorghum it is 2,250, and similarly in other crops. So we were looking at, okay, what is the remedy? Then Dr. Upadhyaya and Ortiz came up with another concept called a mini-core, which is 10% of the core or about 1% of the entire collection. So this is what is called as mini-core, and using that principle of or the concept of doing a mini-core at ICRISAT, we have mini-core collections of chickpea. They have also mini-cores for rice, soybean, pigeon pea, and groundnut. So as I said, the size of the mini-core is only 1%, and therefore it becomes more easy to handle. At the same time that ICRISAT was developing this mini-core collection concept, scientists at ICARDA, the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry in Russia, and the Grains Research and Development Corporation, GRDC in Australia, they started another concept called FIGS, FIGS, Focused Identification of Germplasm Strategy. So looking at some of the environmental parameters to describe the plant germplasm collection sites, and then use these selection criteria to improve the probability of uncovering useful variation. So FIGS method has been successfully used to screen the large febobin collection for traits related to drought adaptation and also to detect stem rust accessions in wheat. So, use of mini-core collections, ICSAT supplied about 266 sets of mini cores and evaluated in 36 countries, and those are listed here. And as you can see in this figure, the top one is the entire collection. So that is 100%. So based on diversity analysis and characterization, then you come to a smaller size, which is the core collection, which is about 10%. And then you characterize these, analyze the diversity, make into different clusters, and then on that basis, you select 10% of that, which is finally 1% of the entire collection, and that is the core, mini core collections. So by using mini core collections, national programs have been able to identify many traits that were needed by the plant breeders. These are a few examples that I have given for chickpea, groundnut, and pigeon pea. Now, we again go into the third aspect, which is the use of wild species in crop improvement. What was also quite evident is that in many breeding programs, very few wild species have been used. And what are those limitations that made people to use very few wild species? Because the wild species have undesirable associations between resistance and pod and seed characteristics and also agronomic traits. Many of the wild species are of long duration. They are also temperature and photoperiod sensitive, so it is difficult to get them to flower and pod at all the locations. And many of them are small seeded, thick shelled, highly reticulated, or constricted, etc. So if you look at in Arachis species, you find these as some of the limiting factors. So what happens is if we start using wild species, it increases the duration of the crop as a result of incorporation of disease resistance from wild species to the cultivated species because of these associations. So this is a pictorial representation of the pre-breeding for utilizing wild species. And in the center here, you see the primary gene pool, and then you have the secondary gene pool, and then you have the tertiary gene pool. So in most cases, we use species from the primary gene pool because they are easily crossable. And sometimes we are also able to use species from the secondary gene pool with different techniques to cross. So by using all these methods, we are able to make the cross and then get the segregating generations and start selecting. So by the time we are able to select useful lines, takes about 5 to 8 years to get this done. So, and then after that, you have different steps of rebreeding that may take another 6 to 8 years. So many people don't want to use that much of time of 10 to 15 years to use wild species to get useful traits into the cultivated species. So therefore, what is suggested is that pre-breeding in any institution should be an institutional responsibility. Institutions should decide, okay, these are the group of scientists who will do pre-breeding, and once they do the pre-breeding and the material is ready to be used by the breeders, then they give it to the breeders, then the breeders start using it. Because otherwise, then it becomes very difficult for the breeders to spend 10 to 15 years before they can start using them in their active breeding programs. So in many institutions, pre-breeding is a separate unit that does only pre-breeding activities using wild species and related wild species to get incorporation of useful traits and then hand it over to the breeders for use in crop improvement. So this is an example of using wild Arachis species for improving seed size and pod yield. On the right is one of the amphidiploids of groundnut, which had a seed size of about 8 grams. And then one of the known varieties of groundnut, TME2, which has about 30 grams seed weight. And crossing these two, we were able to get transgressive segregants in F11 generation, sorry, which is about 140 grams. So it took time, energy, and patience, but then we were able to get those transgressive segregants for high seed size, seed weight. Similarly, in case of chickpea, we were able to use the wild species for improving drought tolerance, looking at the root traits, especially the root length, that is important for enhancing drought tolerance. Up to now, we looked at the use of germplasm, pre-breeding, and use of wild species. So we are now through with that. Now we are going to the other aspects of IPR and related issues. And now currently looking at the IPR, this IPR, or for that matter, PVP, the plant variety protection, is considered very essential that can stimulate research and develop new plant varieties. But there is also the other side of the coin where patenting can encourage biopiracy and of the indigenous knowledge and resources. So we need to be very cautious in ensuring that IPR and PVP are not misused. Looking at biopiracy of genetic resources, this is the wrongful appropriation, usually through patenting. That means they take material from a region or a country and then get it patented in another country, and that's how this is called as biopiracy. Not necessarily the entire genetic material, but they look at the active agents or the knowledge associated with that particular genetic resources. So that is also a possible use of wrong use of genetic resources. So looking at biopiracy of the genetic resources, Uh, Many developed countries receive extensive support on IPRs, whereas low-income countries are sometimes unaware of what to do. And then even if they are aware, they don't have the resources to counter the activities of developed countries who have resources. So therefore, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture was initiated to protect the germplasm and the right to equitable sharing of benefits of plant genetic resources. This was sort of steered by the Food and Agriculture Organization, and now it has become an act. Unfortunately, very few of the developed countries have ratified the treaty so far, although many developing countries have ratified it. So these are the regions or countries that are prone to biopiracy. I have listed them here, including India, China, most of Southeast Asia, Northeast Africa, and Mesoamerica. So where many of the germplasm collections, precious germplasm collections are naturally available, and other people are trying to appropriate those. So these are just a few examples of biopiracy that happened, but later on we were able to sort of rescue those things. For example, basmati rice from India and Pakistan, the jasmine rice from Thailand, and several medicinal and aromatic plants from India. So in terms of minimizing biopiracy, I think, as I mentioned, we need participation of all countries, rich and poor, in the FAO's International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, for its implementation, for equity. We need to document the traditional knowledge in the digital form and then link it to an internationally accepted patent classification system. And then at the local level, we need to adopt what we call the People's Biodiversity Registers. In India, I will come to you a little later, the National Biodiversity Authority has done some of these local level biodiversity registers at the taluka and mandal levels. So, International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources itself, currently only about 130 countries are parties to the treaty, including India. All the CGIAR centers are also party to the treaty. The Standard Material Transfer Agreement, is what we call SMTA, has been implemented since 1st January 2007, and all the countries and CGIAR centers have to report periodically to the governing body in FAO about the germplasm distribution and access. And then the multilateral system for transfer of genetic resources. There are about 35 crops and 29 forages in the Annexure 1 that is freely accessible to all. So in terms of looking at the treaty's objectives, the main objectives are the conservation and sustainable use of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, and at the same time, fair and equitable sharing of the benefits derived from their use for sustainable agriculture and food security. So in terms of if somebody uses this germplasm from one country in another country or within a country, how the benefits can be shared. And there are two major options where they'll have to give a fixed percentage of sales according to an agreed criteria. And then second option is alternative payment, where at a discounted rate of 0.5% of the sales. So that is the second alternative payment. And whatever payment comes to the governing body of the international treaty, this fund is used to manage the treaty activities, but then part of it also goes to the original communities, farming communities from where the germplasm was collected, so that that particular community can use that for germplasm conservation activities. So the benefit sharing mechanism, as I said, will flow primarily to the farmers in the developing countries who conserve and utilize these genetic resources. And I said FAO is the third party beneficiary to carry out the role as per the governing bodies directives. And the FAO and the third party beneficiary will establish a trust account for receiving and sharing the financial resources. So this slide gives the facilitated access under the standard material transfer agreement, and they have defined that in that listing where plants, seedlings, cuttings, seeds and pollen, also DNA, ESTs and BACs can be shared, but not on the others that are listed here. So in terms of the Indian Biodiversity Act, there are no restrictions for receiving any Indian biological resource for research use with SMTA. Sharing of results of research on any Indian biological resource to any recipient in India is also not restricted. Sharing of Indian biological resource to any recipient within India with SMTA is also not restricted, and also we can share any designated germplasm which is non-Indian to any recipient in India and abroad with SMTA. This is what we call the designated germplasm, which is in the Annexure 1. So, however, the National Biodiversity Authority's approval is required if somebody has to transfer any Indian biological resource to any persons for any purpose outside of India. There are some exemptions, for example, international collaborative research agreements and others, but otherwise that is restricted. Also cannot transfer results of any research on Indian biological resource to recipients outside India unless approved by the NBA. Also transfer of any Indian biological resource, of course this applied to ICRISAT locations, so that is also needs approval from NBA. To conclude, crop germplasm are basic to crop improvement programs for sustainable agriculture, and we also noted the low use of germplasm, which is a critical issue, and then we all need to work to enhance the use of germplasm for enhancing the genetic base of the improved cultivars. For doing that, we need to develop small size subsets, either core or mini core or figs, for example, and then identify new and diverse sources that can enhance the use of germplasm in the breeding programs. The related wild species possess novel alleles for developing broad-based cultivars with enhanced resistance and also stable yields. Therefore, we need to improve the use of genetic resources of the wild species as far as possible. Pre-breeding is required to utilize these wild species for expanding the genetic variability. And then all of us as scientists who are involved in crop improvement need to be aware of the NBA and ITPGRFA regulations so that we don't trespass at any stage, so that and be within the limits of what is permitted in the law. So with that, I end my presentation. So over to you, Chaitra.
So thank you so much for such a beautiful presentation, and I must say it's an eye-opener to me, at least, on various aspects of genetics and plant breeding, because I'm not from that background.
Okay.
So we'll be taking questions from our participants now.
Okay.
And the first question is from Mr. Ellen Govan, and he's asking whether we can call land races into land races as pre-breeding.
Dr. Alangavan, good evening. How are you? Are you able to listen?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Okay. So land races are within the cultivated species. So they can also be used in pre-breeding because many of them may have some of the traits that may not be available in the regular improved varieties or cultivars. But preferably for pre-breeding, we tend to use related wild species which are difficult to be used directly by the breeders. Because as I said, pre-breeding is an exercise that has to be done by a different group of scientists for, let's say, 5 to 10 years, and then hand over those useful materials to the breeders. So that is something that needs to be thought over.
Okay. So the next question is from Dr. Maruti Gowda from UK, and he says, "Sir, great presentation and great work by the CG centers, and I work with them extensively. I would like to know what might be the best method for conserving vegetatively propagated crops like bananas, sweet potatoes, cassava, etc. Is there a Svalbard type center for conserving these crops?"
Difficult question, Dr. Maruti Gowda, because I have not worked on vegetatively propagated crops, but as I indicated in one of my slides, in vitro and cryopreservation are some of the methods that are used. And as far as I know, for banana, the IPGRI, IPGRI, now called Bioversity International, has collaboration with one or two institutions in Germany for conserving the vegetatively propagated germplasm uh, in as cryopreservation. But I am not fully aware of all the details. But I think if you contact people in Bioversity International, you would be able to get the additional information.
So the next question is from Komal Rijal. If some breeder wants to do the research by using the seed that is only available in the seed bank, and if there is no any other seed developed during research, what is the provision to refill the seeds that were used? Doesn't it lead to the loss of that particular seed?
Okay, it's a reasonable question. All gene bank managers have that as one of their major responsibility. That as soon as you go to a certain level of seed of that particular variety or land race in the in the gene bank, then you have to go back to the field, regenerate, and then fill that bottle so that it doesn't become empty.
Right.
So that is one of the major responsibilities of the gene bank managers to ensure. In fact, nowadays, all the gene banks, at least the major gene banks, have programs that tell us, okay, that particular line is short of seed. It has only 30% seeds. So that needs to be multiplied in the next season. So the pop-up comes as soon as you take out seed, the message comes. So that is something that has to be done by the gene bank managers.
So Maruti Gowda sir has another question, and his question this time is, the point on time and resources on breeding is highly valid. The current funding models don't allow breeding with wider germplasm and wild relatives due to short duration of the projects. How do you see we can change this? Do you think this is changeable?
Oh, this is something that I also sort of feel as a breeder very bad. And I have been advocating, whenever I talk to the vice chancellors of the universities or heads of the institutions where breeding is one of the activities, to the vice chancellor, I tell them, please don't transfer breeders like you transfer anybody else. Breeding is a long-term activity. You need a minimum of 10 to 15 years before the breeder can really give you the results of his or her research. And many cases, all these short term projects of 3 years, 5 years cannot really support those long term breeding activities. That is why the institution should have what I call a base level of funding, which then gets supported by the project funding to continue these activities. And in fact, in India, we have a foundation of what we call Advanced Training in Plant Breeding Research, ATPBR, where I am one of those who is trying to resurrect what I call the classical plant breeding. Because what I'm finding is many people are telling, oh, molecular breeders can do wonders, all that. But what we are telling is, yes, molecular breeding or gene editing and all those are only tools. A breeding has to be done to get a variety out despite all this. Those are all tools. Plant breeding is the only method which can get you variety. So these are the realities of life that we need to understand.
So, Ilangovan sir also wants to know, developing countries are not equipped with protection of its local ITK, and how do we change this?
Well, I would say only collective action. I think all the scientists need to support conserving the indigenous and traditional knowledge to the extent that is within their realm or purview. And that way we can, each one of us can contribute and make it happen.
Yeah. So he's also asking, will the three-tier benefit sharing mechanism, that is community, country, and FAO, restrict breeders, or will it help breeders boom by reducing the germplasm?
No, sometimes this is well-intended programs get things on the reverse side. No, ITP-JRFA was intended to enhance and exchange the germplasm across countries. But after it has come, we are finding that countries are not exchanging material. It was meant to do that, but then it has not happened. So these are a few things I think which as scientists, we need to educate each other. And of course, there are also rules and regulations. For example, the National Biodiversity Authority has very strict rules. And if we don't follow them, maybe we can be in jail
Yeah.
if we don't follow that. So there are unintended negative benefits that have happened. So we need to be aware of those.
So on this context, we have two more questions. One from Maruti Gowda sir, and so he wants to know what is the actual procedure for sample request, where are the bottlenecks, and he wants to know more about the more lawful way of getting germplasm is one thing. And Mr. Nitesh wants to know how you can stop the smuggling of germplasm from one country to another. So the same context.
uh, how to stop smuggling? That is a tough thing to do because see, people have to be, first of all, aware, and people also need to be patriotic and selfless in the sense that if another country says, okay, I will give you airfare, I will host you here for 3 months, you bring 10 germplasm lines from your country and you will do all that. People have done that, I know that. And this is like selling your own country, which is bad. So people have to realize that they are doing something very wrong. And if they get caught, they could be in jail. So only individual conscience can save this, nothing else. Rules are there, but then only individuals can implement those things. So Dr. Maruti Gowda's question in terms of accessing germplasm from the international centers is not a problem. As long as you know what you want, you put a request to the gene bank managers of those institutions, and it will take its own time in terms of getting the export clearance and all that, and it will be delivered to you with an SMTA, which you need to sign before the material starts flowing out. But getting it from the national programs, as I said, after the Convention on Biological Diversity and then the ITP-JRFA, so countries have become very restrictive in terms of giving out germplasm. And people are trying to change it. It has not happened. But I think we have to start working on it.
Right.
Not easy, but that's what I would say.
Mr. Indranil Bhattacharjee wants to know which millet crop species are more difficult to breed.
So I think like little millet, proso millet, where the flower size is very small, these are really tough. At one point in time, even finger millet was considered very difficult to breed, but then people found ways of making crosses and breeding. So we have to find ways of making crosses. Uh, it's not difficult now, with all these new technologies that are available, inducing male sterility and all those. It's quite possible. But then those are the difficulties that we have.
Right. Okay. Mr. Basavareddera wants to know, how can we break saturation in yield? What method can we use to harness maximum genetic gain taking rice crop?
Well, since I don't work on rice, I cannot fully answer that question. But what I know as of now is in rice, they are trying different physiological methods for increasing yield, like enhancing photosynthetic efficiency, converting rice into C4, and many other things. So those are the possible ways in which people are trying to um, break that yield level or yield barrier. But these are not done overnight. It takes time. But people are trying them. Maybe tomorrow we may have news that they have broken the yield barrier in rice from 12 tons to 15 tons or 18 tons.
Dr. Girish wants to know, how can we use molecular breeding to shorten time in pre-breeding process?
No, there are ways in which people have used, and one of not necessarily molecular methods, but what they call rapid breeding, where using photo and thermosensitivity, you can make the wild species to flower early, and that can be used for making crosses. But otherwise, it's not entirely possible only by using molecular methods, because if you have to use wild species, first and foremost, you need to make the cross. And that making cross is the major thing. And for that, you can't use any molecular techniques. You have to use other traditional physiological and other methods. Yeah.
Yeah. Mr. Manjunath Kulkarni is an agronomist from Italy. So he is asking, can you please tell us the importance of ethnobotany on millets and millet nutrition as a point of nutrition security?
I don't know fully what exactly is meant by ethnobotany, but all I can say is that in the last 10 to 15 years, the Harvest Plus program in the CGIAR has a big program on enhancing mineral content in the millets. That means increasing iron, zinc, uh, magnesium, all those things. And they are quite successful in enhancing these nutritional traits. For example, in some crops, they have increased carotene content. That's increasing carotene content and vitamin A. So these have been done in many crops, and it has been a good and successful program in the what they call it Harvest Plus. It is also called as the biofortification program. So they have been able to biofortify many crops by enhancing many nutritional aspects.
Yeah. Mr. Arun Kashyap wants to know, what's your opinion about combination of speed breeding and biotechnology methods for further crop improvement in less time in India at present in comparison to other countries?
Oh, speed breeding has been catching up in the last few years, and I also mentioned about that a little while ago. And I think both these speed breeding as well as biotechnology related aspects can hasten the development of improved varieties.
Hmm.
So let us say if we were taking 10 to 12 years, as I mentioned earlier, for a breeder to develop a variety, maybe we can do it in 4 to 5 years. But then with all that, you still need to do field level
Right.
classical breeding to get those things. Yeah, they can definitely help, and we should be using all these so that we can deliver the new varieties to the farmers in the shortest possible time.
Okay. Mr. Anil wants to know, though few institutions like UAS Dharwad have got good color cotton germplasm, why is this not taken as important opportunity for organic natural color cotton?
Well, maybe this question should be asked to the Director of Research in UAS Dharwad. In fact, this is one of the questions that I have raised, and I think it's just a question of priority setting by the universities, what they have to do.
Yeah, right.
Definitely, there are good germplasm available within US Dharwad, and these should be used. Some of the breeders who were there earlier did good job. But then, if you change the breeders every 2 or 3 years, where is the continuity? The new breeder doesn't know what the previous one did because there is no handover or takeover in case of breeders. One leaves, and 10 days later, the new one joins, and they don't know. This is one of the very, what you call, avoidable things that can be done better by the universities.
Yeah, I think this is a more of a management problem than the actual science problem. Right.
Yeah, correct.
So, Mr. Ramesh wants to know how to reduce breeding time in the pre-breeding process so that efforts of pre-breeding reach the resource-poor farmers quickly.
Mm, I think part of it I have
Yeah,
answered in the earlier questions. So, pre-breeding, I think some of the technologies of speed breeding can be used to uh, shorten the time taken for the crops, and then also use the other technologies by which we can. But pre-breeding cannot be really hastened to that extent compared to the traditional breeding.
okay. Mr. Ganapati is asking, while using wild species, is it always necessary we need to follow directed pre-breeding where traits are already identified in wild species? Or can we expect segregant for a trait in the interspecific derivatives which is not identified in wild species?
As I mentioned, in case of groundnut, there were transgressive segregants. So you can expect to get things which you didn't expect. But the only thing is you need to have good eyes, not good eyesight, but good eyes that you can catch those variations in the field, for which the breeder needs to visit the field every day. And this is something that I have been telling in my lectures that breeders of today are not visiting the fields to see these subtle changes that are happening. But yes, it is possible, and we need to catch those.
Okay. Mr. Kulkarni from Venice, Italy, he's asking a second question, that is, please throw some light on post-COVID serious niche areas of nutrition security in our nation.
Somehow, I don't like this COVID and post-COVID. I think we should take out COVID and behave as if COVID didn't exist. We should move in the way that we should be moving. And yeah, nutrition is one of the major things. For the last 10 to 15 years, many institutions have been working towards enhancing nutrition. I mentioned about biofortification program of the Harvest Plus and many other programs that people are doing in terms of enhancing nutrition security, maybe increased protein or quality of proteins, increasing the content of nutrients and other things. So these are a few ways where we can enhance nutrition security.
Okay, thank you, sir. So Mr. Indranil wants to know how efficient are chemical gametocides in millet breeding and which one is the best?
I would say I have not worked on the gametocides, so I cannot answer that question. Yeah.
Okay. So Dr. Parashuram Patroti wants to know, what are the approaches to diversify post-rainy season sorghum genetic base by deploying exotic germplasm?
Oh, this particular aspect has been worked on both by the Indian National Program, by the INSAWMIL, International Sorghum and Millets Program of USAID, also by ICRISAT. For whatever reason, the post-rainy or Rabi sorghum genetic improvement has proven to be a very tough nut to crack. We have not been successful in terms of in comparison to what amount of resource, time, and money spent to improve Rabi sorghum yield levels. So I would say we have hit a hard rock in terms of looking at this possibility of improving post-rainy season sorghum.
So there we come to the end of our question answer session, and that's the number of questions we had, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. All the best.